The moon hung low over the Arizona plains, pale and cold, lighting the desert like a ghost's lantern. Wind whispered through the dry grass, carrying the faint cries of coyotes from far-off ridges. A lonely figure moved through the night, wrapped in a blanket of silence and dust. His name was Taza, a warrior of the Apache. Tonight his heart carried the weight of two worlds, the old ways of his people and the fragile thread of life that tied him to his young son. Taz's moccasins pressed softly into the earth, leaving faint tracks that would be gone with the first breath of dawn. The firelight of his small camp flickered behind him, where his son lay sleeping inside a skin tent, wrapped tight against the night chill. Every time the boy coughed, Taz's chest ached. It faced bullets and blades, hunger and storms, but nothing frightened him like the weakness in that small voice. The boy's sickness had come suddenly. Fever took him 3 days ago, leaving his skin hot and his lips dry. The medicine woman said it was a curse, that spirits were angry because Taza had walked too close to the white man's border. Others whispered it was the wolves, creatures of shadow who punished hunters that took too much from the land. But Taza did not believe in punishment, only in survival. Still, tonight, something deep in him stirred, feeling older than pride, older than war. He stood beneath the moon and listened. The desert was never quiet. It spoke in small, sound-shifting sand, the cry of an owl, the rustle of distant movement. Now there was something different, something heavy in the air. A low growl echoed from the ravine nearby, deep and long. The hair on Taz's arms rose. He turned toward the sound and reached for his bow. The wolves had come early. He could see them now, shadows moving against the silver light. 5, maybe 6 of them, slipping out from the dark rocks. Their eyes glowed faintly, not with hunger alone, but something else, something that made even a seasoned warrior pause. These were not ordinary beasts. Taza had hunted wolves before, but never like this. These ones did not flinch or scatter. They stood their ground, their eyes fixed on him, waiting. Taza took a slow step back toward the camp. He knew if they reached his son, there would be no time to fight them all. His bow was strong, his aim sure, but 6 wolves meant 6 arrows, and if one missed, it would be over. The thought of his son's face, pale and sweating under the blankets, filled his chest with fire. He could not lose him. Not after everything the world had already taken. When Taza's wife had died 2 winters ago, he had sworn to raise their son to be strong, to teach him the songs, the hunts, the ways of their people. The boy's laughter had been his only light since then. Now, as the wolves crept closer, that light flickered in danger of being snuffed out. He drew the first arrow and pulled the string tight, his muscles steady despite the pounding of his heart. The leader of the pack stepped forward, larger than the rest, its coat darker than night. Its eyes met his, and for a heartbeat, something passed between them, something almost human, almost sorrowful. Taza hesitated, then released. The arrow struck true, sinking into the beast's shoulder. It yelped, but didn't fall. Instead it snarled and lunged, and the others followed. The air filled with growls, snapping jaws, and the heavy thud of movement. Taza fired again and again, each arrow finding its mark, but the wolves kept coming, their fury unstoppable. He swung his knife, slashing at the nearest one, feeling its breath hot against his arm. Blood his, and there splattered the sand. One wolf leapt and knocked him to the ground. He rolled, striking hard, feeling teeth graze his arm. Pain shot through him, but he didn't stop. He grabbed a burning branch from the fire pit and thrust it at the animals. Flames flared, and for a moment they backed away, their growls fading into the night. Taza dragged himself toward the tent, shouting his son's name. The boy stirred weakly, eyes half open, confusion and fear crossing his small face. Taza knelt beside him, breathing hard. "Stay still," he whispered, pressing a trembling hand to the boy's forehead. "Your father is here." But the peace lasted only a moment. From outside, another growl rose louder, closer. The leader was not dead, stood beyond the tent flap, watching them, its breath white in the cold air. The arrow still jutted from its shoulder, but its eyes were burning with something more than pain. Taza could feel it like a pulse in the earth beneath him. He stepped out, gripping the firebrand again. The wolf stared back, motionless. Around them, the desert held its breath. Then the creature raised its head and howled, a long, mournful sound that seemed to shake the stars themselves. In that cry, Taza heard something strange, not threat, but grief. It echoed across the canyon, fading slowly until silence returned. The wolf turned and limped into the shadows, its pack following behind. Taza stood there for a long time, the firelight flickering against his face. He didn't understand what had just happened. He had fought to protect his son, yet the wolves had not killed him when they could have. They had left him alive. It made no sense. When he finally turned back to the tent, he found the boy sitting up, his fever strangely gone. The color had returned to his cheeks, his eyes bright again. "Father," the child said softly. The wolves were not angry. They were calling for someone. Taza froze, staring at him. "What do you mean, my son?" The boy looked toward the canyon, his small hand clutching the blanket. "I saw a woman with them," he whispered. "She was standing behind the biggest one. She looked like Mother." Taza felt the air leave his lungs. The fire cracked softly beside him, throwing sparks into the dark. He wanted to deny it, to tell the boy it was a dream brought by fever. But deep inside, something in him shifted. The sound of the wolf's howl still echoed in his bones, haunting and familiar. He turned his eyes to the horizon, where the first hint of dawn was breaking. The desert seemed alive now, awake in ways he had never felt before. The wind carried the faint scent of sage and something else, something he couldn't name but felt in his heart. That night had changed him. He didn't yet understand how or why, but he knew his path would no longer be the same. Somewhere beyond the ridges, in the wild lands where spirits still walked, answers waited. The wolves had come for a reason. The fight had not been about survival alone, had been a message. Taza gathered his bow and knife, his movements slow and thoughtful. His son watched him, trust shining in his young eyes. "Are they gone?" the boy asked. "For now," Taza said quietly, "but they will return. And when they do, we must be ready." As the sun began to rise, painting the desert gold, Taza stood tall and looked toward the distant mountains. His heart was still heavy, but beneath that weight was something new, something alive. The world had spoken to him in the language of wolves and spirits, and though he did not yet understand, he knew this was only the beginning. Far in the shadows of the canyon, unseen by human eyes, the dark wolf paused and turned back. For a fleeting moment, its gaze met the sunrise, and within that light was the shape of a woman, her face gentle, her eyes filled with sorrow and love. Then she faded like mist, leaving behind only the echo of her voice carried by the wind. And Taza, standing miles away, felt that echo in his chest. His heart, once hardened by loss, began to tremble not with fear, but with something he had long forgotten how to feel. The desert was quiet again, but its silence held promise. The warrior who had fought against the wolves to save his son was no longer the same man. Something inside him had awakened, something that would soon lead him deep into the heart of both man and spirit. The journey ahead was uncertain, but one thing was clear: his fight was not over yet. The morning sun rose over the desert like a slow-burning flame, pushing the shadows back into the canyons and cliffs. The air was crisp and still, carrying the scent of dust, sage, and dry grass. Taza stood outside the tent, his bow resting at his side, his thoughts tangled like roots beneath the sand. His son was alive, his fever gone, as if washed away by the night wind. But what haunted Taza now was not fear, it was the memory of the wolves and the voice of his dead wife whispered through his child's words. All his life, Taza had trusted what his eyes could see and what his hands could hold. The Apache way taught that the world was full of signs and spirits, but he had learned to rely on his instincts as a hunter, not on visions. Yet the memory of that wolf's eyes, filled with something more than rage, would not leave him. He could still feel the heat of its breath and the sorrow in its howl. It was as if the creature had looked straight into his heart and found something broken there. Inside the tent, his son sat quietly, wrapping the blanket tighter around his shoulders. The boy was small, no more than 7 summers old, but there was a strange calm in him that morning. He was no longer weak or trembling. His voice when he spoke carried a certainty that unsettled Taza. "Father," he said, "Mother wasn't angry. She wanted to help us. I felt her hand on mine when the wolves came." Taza's jaw tightened. "You were dreaming," he said softly. The boy shook his head. "I saw her. She looked sad. She said the wolves were not our enemies. They were guarding something." Taza said nothing. He stepped outside and looked toward the distant mountains, where the canyons cut deep into the land like old scars. He had hunted in those lands since his youth, and he knew every ridge, every dry stream, every whisper of wind. Yet now, he wondered if there were things in that desert he had never truly seen. Later that day, Taza packed what little they had: dried meat, a water skin, and his bound lifted his son onto a small brown horse. The boy's thin arms wrapped around his father's waist as they rode east toward the hills. He told himself they needed to move for safety, away from where the wolves had come, but deep inside, he knew he was searching for something else in Cerns he couldn't name. The sun climbed higher, burning the horizon, and the desert stretched endlessly around them. The land was harsh but beautiful, painted with red rocks and scattered cactus. The wind carried whispers of stories older than memory. As they rode, Taza thought of his father, who had taught him that every creature in the desert had a spirit. "Respect the wolf," his father had once said. "It hunts like we do. It loves its kin like we do. It kills to live, not for pride." Back then, Taza had nodded but never understood. War had hardened him. When white soldiers came and the Apache were pushed from their lands, Taza learned to trust no one and nothing beyond his own strength. He had fought, he had lost, and he had buried too much to believe in the old spirits. But now, after that night, something inside him stirred a feeling that maybe the spirits had never left at all. By the time they reached the ridge, the sun was sinking low, painting the sky in streaks of golden blood. From the high ground, Taza could see the shadowed valley below, a wild stretch of pine and rock that led to the old canyon where his people once held their ceremonies. It had been years since anyone dared to go there. The elders said it was sacred, guarded by the spirits of the earth and the animals that once roamed freely. Some said the wolves still gathered there under the full moon. As night approached, Taza built a small fire and laid his son down to rest. The flames flickered, dancing across the stones. He sat beside them, sharpening his knife, but his mind was far away. He thought of his wife, how she had laughed when they were young, how her hair had smelled of smoke and juniper, how she had died during a raid while he was away. He had never forgiven himself for that. The image of her standing beside the wolves haunted him now. Suddenly, a sound broke through the silence, a low rustling in the brush. Taza's hand went to his bow. His heart pounded as he turned toward the darkness. A pair of eyes gleamed faintly beyond the firelight. This time it wasn't the cold gaze of a predator, but something gentler, curious. Slowly, the shape of a single wolf stepped into view. Its coat shimmered gray under the moonlight, its movements calm and deliberate. Taza rose to his feet, every instinct telling him to defend his camp, yet something in the animal's stance stopped him.
Oh.
The wolf did not snarl or approach. It stood still, watching him. Then it turned its head toward the canyon, as if urging him to follow. For a moment, Taza hesitated. Fire cracked behind him, and his son stirred in his sleep, looked once more at the wolf. It was waiting. By the time he decided to follow, the creature had already slipped into the shadows. Taza moved quietly, keeping his steps soft on the sand. The desert at night was alive, the whisper of insects, the rustle of leaves, the low hum of distant wind. He followed the faint trail down into the canyon, guided by the sound of trickling water from a hidden spring. There, in the heart of the canyon, he saw something that made him stop. A ring of stones stood in the clearing, their surfaces carved with symbols from the old Apache tongue marks of the ancestors. In the center of the circle lay the remains of a fire long extinguished, surrounded by wolf tracks. The scent of sage still lingered, though no one had been there for years. He felt a chill crawl down his spine. His father had told him of this place once, sacred ground where warriors came to speak with the spirits of their dead. Few had ever returned from it unchanged. Taza knelt beside the stones and touched the ground. It was warm. He could feel a faint heartbeat in the earth, as if the land itself was alive. The air thickened around him, heavy with memories and sorrow. For the first time in years, he closed his eyes and whispered his wife's name. The wind answered, soft and low. He opened his eyes, and there she was, not in flesh, but in the shimmer of moonlight that gathered near the stones. Her shape was faint, her face gentle, the same as the night she had died. He wanted to reach for her, but his hands trembled. "You should not be here," her voice came, distant and fragile. "The world of the living and the dead must not touch." Taza swallowed hard. Then why do you call to me? Why send the wolves? They are not mine to command, she said. They serve the old spirits as I do now. Land remembers those who forget it. You have turned your heart away, Taza. The desert knows it. The wolves know it. He felt anger rising in him. I fought to keep our people alive. I did what I had to. Her expression softened. I know, but your spirit has gone cold. The child carries what you have lost, the bond between man and the land. If he is to live, you must find it again. Before he could speak, her image began to fade, her voice a whisper on the wind. Follow the wolves. They will lead you to what you have forgotten. And then she was gone. Taza stood alone beneath the moon, his chest heavy, his thoughts spiraling. He looked around the clearing, searching for the wolf, but it had vanished too. Only the sound of the wind and the rustle of distant leaves remained. When he returned to the camp, his son was awake, sitting by the fire with wide eyes. Father, the boy said, I heard Mother's voice again. She said the same words you did. Taza froze. The flames cast trembling shadows over their faces. He didn't know what to say. Something beyond understanding was happening, something that tied his family to the wolves, to the land, to the spirits themselves. He looked into the darkness beyond the fire and saw, for an instant, a pair of glowing eyes watching them from the ridge. Then they disappeared. Sleep did not come easily that night. Taza lay awake, listening to the desert breathe. Every sound, every gust of wind, seemed to carry meaning. He knew the wolves would return. Whether as guides or enemies, he did not know. When dawn broke, the boy pointed toward the horizon. They're waiting, he said. And sure enough, far off in the golden light, Taza could see the faint outlines of wolves moving along the ridge, their shapes barely visible against the sun. His path was set now. He would follow them, though he did not know where they would lead, or what truth awaited in the heart of the desert. But deep inside he felt something new stirring, an echo of his old faith, a pulse of life returning to his soul. The Apache warrior had fought against the wolves to save his son, though he would walk beside them, to save something far greater. His spirit, the wind, carried the smell of rain that morning, though no clouds hung in the sky. It was the kind of wind that whispered warnings across the plains, stirring dust and memories alike. Taza rode slowly beside his son, the horse's hooves pressing deep marks into the dry ground. Ahead, the wolves moved like ghosts, silent and sure, leading them eastward through the broken lands. The desert stretched endlessly, but there was something alive in the stillness, as if the earth itself was watching. Taza didn't understand what bound him to follow them. Maybe it was his wife's voice that lingered in his heart, or the strange calm he saw in his son's eyes. Maybe it was guilt, or faith, or the thin line between both. All he knew was that he couldn't turn back now. The world behind him felt smaller each day, like a dream fading at dawn. The boy clung to his father's waist, his small fingers warm against Taza's side. Father, he said quietly, they're not afraid of us. Taza glanced toward the ridge where two wolves stood watching them. They should be, he said, his voice low. Wolves fear man's fire. The boy shook his head. These don't. They know we won't hurt them. There was certainty in his tone that unsettled. Taza, his son, had always been quiet, thoughtful, but since that night, something about him had changed. His fever had left him with strange dreams and words that carried weight. At times, it was as though the boy saw things beyond what his eyes could show. As the day went on, they reached a narrow valley bordered by steep cliffs. A small stream wound through it, its water cold and clear. The wolves paused there, drinking. Taza stopped his horse and climbed down, filled his hands with water, letting it run over his face. It felt good against his sunburned skin, though the air was still heavy with tension. He caught sight of the wolf leader again, the dark one, with the scar along its shoulder, the same one from that night. Its eyes locked on his, calm yet sharp. The two stared at each other for a long moment. There was no fear, only recognition, as if the creature knew his soul better than he did himself. Taza's son dismounted and knelt beside the stream, watching the wolves. Father, he said, the dark one isn't angry anymore. How do you know, he told me, the boy said simply. Taza's breath caught. He spoke. The boy nodded, his small fingers tracing shapes in the water. Not with words, I just knew. He he said. We're close to where the spirit sleeps. Taza felt his pulse quicken. The spirit, the word struck something deep within him. He remembered stories told by the elders around the fire when he was a child. Stories of a sleeping guardian buried in the desert, a force that protected the Apache lands long ago. They said it would awaken when the bond between man and the earth was broken. He had always thought them nothing more than tales to keep children from wandering too far. But now, with the wolves leading and the desert alive in strange ways, he wasn't so sure. They followed the stream deeper into the valley until the sun sank low. The cliffs cast long shadows, and the air cooled. Taza built a fire and roasted what little meat they had left. His son sat close, staring into the flames. The wolves lingered nearby, their eyes glinting in the dark. It felt as though the whole valley was waiting for something. That night Taza dreamed again of his wife. She stood beside the dark wolf, her face calm, but her eyes full of sorrow. "You are walking between two worlds," she said, "the land and the spirit, the living and the dead. If you choose wrong, both will be lost." When he awoke, his heart was pounding. The fire had burned down to embers. His son was gone. Panic seized him. He rose, grabbing his knife, scanning the shadows. The tracks were fresh, small feet moving toward the cliffs. He followed fast, his breath heavy in the cold morning air. As he reached the rocks, he heard something, his son's voice, soft and steady, speaking words he didn't understand. He climbed higher and found the boy standing at the mouth of a narrow cave. The wolves were gathered around him, watching silently. The boy turned as his father approached, his face calm. "She's here," he said. "Mother." Taz's knees weakened. "This is not her place, my son. The dead belong to the wind. She wants to show us something," the boy whispered, inside. Before Taza could stop him, the boy stepped into the cave. The wolves followed, their forms melting into the darkness. Taza hesitated, torn between fear and faith. Then he followed. The cave opened into a vast hollow beneath the earth. The walls shimmered faintly with old drawings, hunters, spirits, wolves, and suns. It was the kind of place his ancestors might have prayed in centuries ago. The air was thick and cool, carrying a hum that seemed to come from deep within the rock. At the far end, the boy knelt before a stone altar. Upon it lay a carved figure, wolf with wings made of light and shadow. Taz's breath caught in his throat. The spirit guardian. His wife's voice echoed softly through the cave. "The land is bleeding, Taza. The rivers fade, the herds die, the people turn on one another. The bond that once kept man and nature together is breaking. The wolves guard what is left, but even they cannot hold forever." Taz's hands trembled. "What do you want from me? You must remember," she said. "You must help your people remember." The boy touched the stone figure gently. The walls seemed to come alive, glowing faintly as if reacting to his touch. The wolves lifted their heads and howled, their voices blending into the wind outside. It was not a song of war, but of mourning. Then, as quickly as it had begun, the glow faded, as the air grew still. The wolves turned and slipped out of the cave one by one. Taza lifted his son into his arms. The child was pale but breathing steady, his eyes distant, as if seeing things beyond the world of men. Taza carried him out into the light. The valley seemed different, no quieter, heavier, as though something old had stirred and then gone back to sleep. They camped near the stream again. For hours, Taza sat watching his son sleep, his mind racing. The message was clear, yet its meaning felt too large to grasp. The land dying. The spirit weakening. And he, an Apache warrior who had once turned his heart cold, was being asked to bridge something he had forgotten how to believe in. As dawn broke, he saw movement on the ridge. A group of riders, white men, soldiers from the fort. His heart tensed. They were coming fast. He doused the fire and hid his son among the rocks. When the soldiers reached the stream, their leader called out. "We're looking for a boy," he said. "Word is the Apache took him from one of our settlements." Taz's blood ran cold. His people had not raided in months. He knew this was no misunderstanding. It was a lie meant to justify more bloodshed, but why now? Why here? The officer's eyes swept the valley. "You're far from your land, Apache," he said. "Hand over the child." Taza said nothing. The wolves had vanished. but he could feel them near, watching from the shadows. His knife was at his belt, his bow close by, but he knew a fight now would only bring death. The boy was the key to something greater, something beyond revenge. The soldier raised his rifle. "I won't ask again." A sudden growl cut through the tension. The dark wolf appeared on the ridge above, teeth bared, eyes blazing. The other wolves followed, a silent army of fur and shadow. The horses panicked, rearing and snorting. The soldiers shouted, firing into the air. But the wolves didn't attack. They surrounded the valley, cutting off escape, holding their ground like guardians. In that chaos, Taza grabbed his son and fled into the canyon. Bullets whistled past, striking stone. The wolves moved with them, guiding their path through narrow passages until the sound of pursuit faded. When they stopped, Taza looked back at the ridge. The wolves were gone again. The silence returned, heavy and unbroken. His son clung to him, trembling. "They saved us," the boy said softly. Taza nodded, his breath ragged. For now, he looked at the endless desert ahead and knew this was far from over. The soldiers would return, bringing more men, more anger. The wolves had shown mercy, but mercy could not last forever. Something was building something that tied the spirit world and the living in one long breath of danger. As they walked deeper into the canyons, Taza realized that the fight he once thought was for his son's life had become something much larger. It was a fight for balance, for the bond between man and nature that had been forgotten, and for the soul of a land on the edge of being lost. The path ahead was dark and uncertain. The wolves would return when the time came, and when they did, Taza knew the truth of his heart would be tested again. The battle was no longer about fear or survival, it was about redemption. And somewhere in the quiet of the desert wind, his wife's voice whispered once more, "The spirit sleeps still, Taza," but not for long. The sun was sinking behind the mountains when Taza felt the storm gathering. The wind came first, dry and sharp, rolling through the canyons like a restless spirit. The air carried a strange heaviness, as though the land itself was holding its breath. He and his son had been traveling for 2 days since the attack, following the path of the wolves deeper into the desert, where red cliffs rose like old gods and shadows stretched long across the ground. Each mile took them farther from the reach of soldiers, yet closer to something far more dangerous, something ancient and waiting. The boy rode ahead on the small horse, his eyes distant, as if listening to voices no one else could hear. Taza watched him carefully, worry hidden beneath his calm face. The child spoke less now, but when he did, his words carried a weight far beyond his years. He would whisper things about the earth's breathing, about wolves guarding the sleeping spirit, about light and darkness in balance. Taza didn't understand it all, but he could feel truth behind those words, truth that frightened him more than the soldiers ever had. At night, the wolves would appear again, circling their camp but never attacking. Their eyes glowed faintly in the dark, like stars scattered across the desert floor. Sometimes Taza could swear he heard them whispering, not in words, but in low growls and sighs that seemed to carry meaning. He didn't know if it was his mind playing tricks, or if something deep within the land was truly waking. On the 3rd morning, they reached a place where the earth split open into a vast gorge. The canyon walls shimmered with red and gold stone, carved by centuries of wind and water. Down below, a narrow path twisted into the heart of the gorge, where a faint light flickered like fire beneath the ground. The boy looked toward it and said quietly, "That's where it sleeps." Taza felt the weight of those words settle in his chest. He knew what the boy meant, the spirit, the guardian his wife had spoken of. But what did it mean for it to sleep? What would happen if it woke? They descended into the canyon as the sky darkened. The wind grew stronger, echoing through the cliffs with a low moan that sounded almost like chanting. Taz's instincts told him to turn back, but something stronger pulled him forward. The boy led with surprising certainty, as though guided by an unseen hand. When they reached the bottom, the air was colder. Strange symbols were carved into the wall circles. Wolves, suns, and human figures reaching toward the sky. Taza ran his fingers over them. The carvings felt alive, pulsing faintly beneath his skin. The wolves gathered behind them, silent sentinels with eyes glowing softly in the dim light. The boy walked ahead until he stood before a great stone door built into the canyon wall. It was covered in markings that shimmered faintly, reacting to his presence. "It's calling," he said softly. Taz's breath quickened. It's behind it. The heart of the land, the boy answered, but it's hurt. The balance is breaking. Before Taza could speak, the earth trembled. A distant rumble echoed through the gorge, and dust fell from the cliffs. The wolves raised their heads, their growls low and uneasy. The light beneath the stone door flickered brighter, and the wind began to swirl, lifting sand into the air. Taza stepped forward, pulling his son back. We don't know what's inside. Stay close. But even as he spoke, a sharp whistle cut through the wind. He turned just in time to see a bullet strike the rock beside him. The crack of gunfire followed, echoing through the canyon. Soldiers, Taz's heart clenched, pushed his son behind a boulder and drew his bow. Dust rose as horses thundered into view from the ridge above, rifles glinting in the dying light. They had been followed. The officer from before rode at the front, shouting orders. There he is, the savage and the boy. The wolves scattered, some melting into the rocks, others circling wide. Taza loosed an arrow that struck one of the riders, sending him tumbling from his horse. The others fired back, bullets sparking off the canyon walls. The boy cried out as the earth shook beneath them again, a deeper rumble rising from below as if the land itself was waking. Father, they can't shoot here, the boy said, his voice trembling but certain. The spirit will protect us. Taza didn't answer. He grabbed his son's hand and ran along the canyon wall, arrows and bullets flying past. The wolves moved beside them, fast and fierce, attacking any soldier who came too close. The air filled with chaos snarls, gunfire, the pounding of hooves, and the roar of the wind growing louder with each heartbeat. They reached the stone door again. The light from its carvings pulsed wildly now, bright enough to hurt the eyes. The boy stepped forward despite Taz's grip, pressing his small palm against the stone. It's time, he whispered. The ground split open beneath their feet. Shockwave rippled through the canyon, throwing men and horses to the ground. The wolves howled as the stone door cracked down the center, releasing a burst of white light that filled the air. The soldiers screamed, shielding their eyes. Taza held his son tight, feeling the world tilt beneath him. When the light dimmed, the canyon had changed. The walls glowed faintly, and the air felt thick, alive, humming with power. The soldiers lay scattered, disoriented, their rifles lost in the sand. The wolves stood between them and Taza, growling deep and steady. From within the broken doorway came a sound, a slow, heavy heartbeat that shook the ground.
Us?
Taza's son turned toward it, his eyes distant. It's waking, he said. Taza stared at the light spilling from the crack in the stone. What happens when it wakes? The boy looked up at him, his expression calm and sad. It will choose. Before Taza could ask what he meant, the officer staggered to his feet, his face pale with fear and rage. You devil, he shouted, raising his pistol. You brought this curse, he fired. Taza moved instinctively, but the wolves were faster. The Dark One lunged, knocking the officer to the ground. The gun went off again, echoing through the canyon. Asa couldn't tell who had been hit. The boy cried out, reaching toward the light. The pulse from within the stone grew faster, like a giant heart beating in pain. The earth trembled harder, cracks spidering through the ground. Soldiers who could still move scrambled for their horses, their fear greater than their hatred now. Some fled up the canyon, others simply disappeared into the dust. The wind roared, carrying voices, soft, ancient, calling from somewhere deep within the stone. Taza fell to his knees, pulling his son close. The boy's skin was hot, glowing faintly with the same light that came from the door. His small hands clutched Taza's arm. It's not angry, he said weakly. It just wants to be remembered. Taz's mind spun. He didn't know if this was spirit magic or madness. He looked at the wolves. They stood in a circle around them, silent, their eyes fixed on the light. The Dark One limped closer, the wound on its shoulder bleeding, yet it bowed its head to the boy. The pulse grew louder still. It wasn't just sound. It was feeling deep and powerful, pressing against every part of the land. The light spread from the doorway, washing over the rocks, the sand, the wolves, and the sky. For a moment, it was as if day and night had fused into one. Then, from the heart of the light, a figure began to take shape. It wasn't human, nor entirely beast. Its outline shifted, part wolf, part shadow, part flame. Eyes like molten gold opened, ancient and knowing. Every wolf lowered its head. Taza couldn't breathe. His son stared at the figure, his lips parting in awe. The Guardian, he whispered. The spirit's gaze turned toward them. Its voice, when it came, was both thunder and whisper. The bond has been broken by greed and blood. The earth weeps. You, son of man, have seen both the ruin and the hope. What will you give to restore what was lost? Taza couldn't speak. His heart pounded, his throat dry. The spirit's eyes shifted between him and the boy. Your people forgot, it said. They took without giving. They turned from the wolves, from the land, from the balance. You were chosen to remember. The choice is yours. Life for life. Heart for heart. The light flickered, and the canyon trembled again. The boy clutched Taz's hand, his eyes full of trust and fear. Father, he said softly, don't be afraid. Before Taza could answer, the ground cracked open beneath the altar. Flames of light rose into the air, twisting like wind and fire. The wolves howled in unison, their voices rising to meet the storm. The spirit raised its great head, and the wind screamed through the canyon. Taza pulled his son close as the earth shook, torn between the urge to flee and the pull to stay. He knew this was the moment everything had led to, the moment where the fate of the land, the wolves, and his own soul would be decided. The guardian's eyes blazed brighter, and the voice came again, shaking the stones around them. Choose, Apache. Choose before the dawn. The wind howled louder, and the desert seemed to twist with it, caught between life and ruin. Taza's grip tightened around his son as the world shook apart, his heart torn between love and duty, between man and spirit, between the past and the future that waited just beyond the storm. The wind slowed. The roar that had filled the canyon began to fade into a low hum, like the breath of the earth calming after a long cry. The bright light dimmed, leaving behind a soft golden glow that shimmered across the sand. Taza held his son close, his heart pounding as silence returned to the desert. The wolves stood still, their eyes glowing faintly, waiting. In that quiet, Taza felt something change within him, something deep and ancient settle back into balance. The Great Spirit, the Guardian, stood before them, its massive form no longer fierce, but peaceful. The golden light around it softened, revealing a calm strength that seemed to stretch beyond time. Its eyes met Taza's, and he understood what it wanted: not blood, not sacrifice, but remembrance. It wasn't demanding a life to be taken, it was asking for a promise, a renewal of what had been forgotten. Taza knelt, pressing his hand against the ground.
Ow.
The earth felt warm beneath his palm, alive again. I remember, he said quietly. And I'll teach my son to remember too. His words trembled, but they carried the truth of his heart. The guardian bowed its head slightly, as if in acknowledgement. The light began to fade from its body, turning to soft embers that drifted upward into the night sky like glowing dust. The wolves lifted their heads, howling one last time, a call that echoed through the canyons and across the desert plains. When the sound faded, the spirit was gone. Only the warmth of its presence remained. Taza looked down at his son, who stood watching the last flickers of light disappear. The boy's eyes were calm again, no longer glowing, but filled with quiet strength. It's gone, he said softly. Taza nodded. No, he said after a moment. It's still here. Just not in a way we can see. The boy looked around the canyon. The cracks in the ground had begun to close, the rocks no longer trembling. The wolves turned one by one and vanished into the shadows, their shapes melting into the stone and brush, like smoke returning to the wind. The last to leave was the dark one, the same wolf that had guarded them from the start. It paused and looked back at them, its eyes catching the first light of dawn before it disappeared beyond the ridge. When the sun rose, the land seemed different. The air smelled clean, and the sky stretched wide and clear. Taza and his son stood at the edge of the canyon, looking toward the horizon where light touched the mountains. The world felt new, as though something heavy had been lifted from it. They gathered their things in silence. The path home would be long, but Taza no longer felt the same weight he had carried before. I'd faced the spirits of his ancestors and the greed of men, and somehow both had led him to this moment of peace. His people had always believed that the land was alive, and now he understood what that truly meant. It wasn't just about survival or tradition. It was about connection between man and earth, between past and future. As they rode through the desert, they passed the remnants of the soldiers' camp. The wind had already begun to erase the tracks, covering everything with new sand. Only a few scattered objects remained: broken rifles, torn tents, and the sound of silence reclaiming what had been. Disturbed, Taza didn't linger. He had no anger left, only understanding. The soldiers had come with fear, not knowing what they were destroying. But now, the land had spoken for itself. By the time they reached the open plains, the boy had fallen asleep on his horse. His small head rested against the animal's mane, his breathing steady. Taza looked at him with quiet pride. The child had carried something far greater than he ever should have, yet he had done it with courage. He would grow with the stories of what had happened, but Taza would make sure those stories were not about fear or power. It would be about balance, respect, and memory. That night, they made camp near a stream that cut through the valley. The stars were bright above them, and the wind carried the soft sounds of night creatures moving through the brush. Taza sat by the fire, watching the flames dance. He thought of his wife, of how she used to hum to the child before sleep. He could almost hear her voice in the wind. The boy stirred beside him, waking for a moment. "Father," he murmured, "will the spirit come back?" Taza smiled faintly. "Only if we forget." The boy nodded, closing his eyes again. "And we won't forget." Taza looked toward the horizon where the sky met the earth in a thin line of gold. The wolves' song still echoed faintly in his memory, a reminder that everything living was connected. For the first time in a long while, he felt at peace, not because the struggle was over, but because he had found meaning in it. When dawn came again, they continued their journey toward the old settlement. The people there had been scattered, their homes left empty after the soldiers' raids. But as Taza approached the familiar cliffs, he saw smoke rising from a few hearths. The tribe had begun to return. Some had survived, hiding in the mountains, waiting for the right time. When they saw Taza and his son, they came forward with disbelief and relief written on their faces. An elder stepped out, his hair silver under the morning light. "We thought the land had turned against us," he said. The ground shook, and the rivers ran red. Taza nodded. "It was angry," he said simply. "But it's healing now. We all are." He told them the story not of battle or victory, but of awakening. He spoke of the wolves, of the guardian, of the balance that had been broken and restored. The people listened in silence, their faces lit by the fire that night. When he finished, there were tears in some eyes and quiet resolve in others. The elder placed a hand on Taza's shoulder. "You have carried the burden of many generations," he said. "Now it is time to teach again, to remember." In the days that followed, the tribe rebuilt. They cleared the broken homes, planted new seeds near the river, and gathered in the evenings to tell the old stories again. The wolves returned to the nearby hills, no longer feared, but seen as protectors. The children would watch them from afar, whispering their names in awe. Taza's son grew stronger each day. He still sometimes woke in the night, dreaming of light and thunder, but the fear had left his eyes. He would sit beside his father and listen as Taza taught him the ways of the land, how to track the wind, how to read the stars, how to listen to what the earth said beneath his feet. The boy learned quickly, and his calm spirit reminded Taza of the guardian's voice. Seasons passed, and the desert bloomed again after the rain. The people began to sing songs of renewal, songs that told of how the land had once spoken and how man had listened. Travelers who passed through the region would tell stories of seeing wolves walking beside campfires without fear, of hearing deep heartbeats in the earth during quiet nights. Some dismissed them as myths, but for those who had lived through it, they knew better. One evening, as the sun dipped low, Taza and his son stood on the ridge overlooking the valley. The sky burned with orange and gold, and the sound of the wind moved softly through the grass. "The world feels different now," the boy said. Taza looked at him and smiled. "It's not the world that changed, it's us. We finally learned to listen." The boy smiled back, his eyes reflecting the fading light. In that moment, Taza felt the presence of the guardian again, not as a vision, but as a warmth in his chest, a quiet assurance that the land was alive, watching, and at peace. As night fell, they walked back toward the fire where their people waited. The stars began to appear, one by one, and somewhere in the distance, a wolf howled, a calm, steady sound that carried across the valley like a blessing. Taza paused for a moment to listen, his heart steady, his spirit light. The world was whole again, and though time would move on, the story would remain carried in their voices, their footsteps. And in the living breath of the desert that would remember long after they were gone,